Hi, my name is Raul. I'm from Estonian network of people living with HIV. Thousands of people with AIDS in Estonia are alive because of programs and partnerships like UNAIDS Global Fund and AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Many of these life-saving programs are threatened today. Estonian network of people living with HIV signed onto the Keep the Promise on AIDS HIV declaration and also for the march in Washington before the opening of the International AIDS Conference next July. Keep saving lives. Please join us to ask world leaders to keep the promise on AIDS. Sign onto the declaration today and join us in Washington next summer. See you there.
I've been the lead coordinator of 3 opening day marches of the International AIDS Conferences starting in Barcelona in 2002, Toronto, and Mexico City. But this is much more than an opening day march. This is the March on Washington. More than 1,000 groups, as Barbara said, from around the world have already joined AHF a year in advance to send a message to Washington and world leaders. The war on AIDS has not been won. And we must keep the promise to the 27 million people around the world fighting to stay alive with no access to treatment. They cannot be abandoned, and we will not abandon them. This is a human rights issue, the most fundamental, the right to life. This is the first time this conference has been in the United States in 21 years, and the time is right. In this country, we have seen a resurgence of grassroots activism on AIDS, and that is because of a new threat and an old threat: access to life-saving medication. In the United States in 2011, a growing number of Americans are on waiting lists for the drugs they need to stay alive. This is not acceptable. Thousands of activists from around the country will be pouring into D.C. for the March on Washington on July 22, 2012, as well as 25,000 delegates from around the world coming to the conference. It's a window of opportunity that we must seize. The message will be, keep the promise on HIV/AIDS. It is truly a matter of life and death for millions of men, women, and children around the world. This is a critical time in our history. We must do the right thing and keep the promise on HIV/AIDS and send the message to the world leaders that we're speaking up, we're reminding them they cannot abandon millions of people around the world.
Hola, mi nombre es Andrés Cruz de COCUT, una organización no gubernamental en México. Miles de personas con SIDA en México están vivos gracias a los programas y las sociedades como PEPFAR, el ONICIDA y AHF. Muchos de estos programas que salvan vidas están amenazados. Nosotros ya firmamos el manifiesto de la marcha rally Mantener la promesa sobre el SIDA, que se realizará en la Conferencia Internacional sobre el SIDA en julio del 2012 en Washington, D.C. Únanse a los miles de organizaciones que ya han firmado para pedir a los líderes mundiales mantener la promesa sobre el SIDA y seguir salvando vidas. Entra hoy al web para firmar el manifiesto y únanse a nosotros en la marcha rally en Washington el próximo verano. Muchas gracias.
I've been a DC resident for about 10 years, but I'm also a Nigerian. And you hear that 60% of those living with this virus live on the African continent. Those numbers seem large, but their names and their faces to each of those people. There's hardly any family that hasn't been affected by this disease. In Nigeria, I think the prevalence rates are at 3.6%, and 1 million people in Lagos are living with this disease. I think that there is no more important a time to continue to fight, to scale up treatment, to find people who have this disease and get them treated. And we still hear that 5,000 people are dying every single day from HIV.
The medical director at the Blair Underwood Healthcare Center in Washington, D.C., where I have the privilege of providing care to HIV-positive individuals regardless of their ability to pay. And I say the privilege because I mean the privilege. It is a privilege to be involved with each individual each and every day. What does care mean? What does treatment mean? Care means we can provide HIV testing, we can do education, we can treat people once they are treated, once they're diagnosed to be HIV positive. What does treatment mean? Treatment does not mean simply medications. It's access to the doctor, it's access to having your blood drawn, it's access to your nurse, and it is definitely access to medications. I have been, for 20 years, an HIV specialist in Washington, D.C. I've seen the epidemic turn around, where we currently have waiting lists again. When we first had waiting lists, people had to wait to be put on a list to go on a protease inhibitor, a life-saving medication. And these medications are life-saving. I remind my patients every day. They tell me, Doc, that they say I shoot from the hip. And I do, because I ask them to take their care seriously, because I take their care seriously. And I know that together with AHF, if the President and the United States keeps its promise and fulfills the PEDFAR committed amount, if the pharmaceutical companies lower the cost of the medications, if we work every day to be diligent in getting people tested and educating them about how they can keep themselves negative, this is the challenge I give to myself, to remind me not to become complacent, to remind you all that we need to march on Washington, D.C. next year, July 22nd, 2012, so we can all keep the promise. Thank you.
In South Africa are alive because of the programs and partnership like PEPFAR, UNAIDS, and AHF. Unfortunately, many of these life-saving programs are threatened today. Lifeline South Africa signed on the Keep the Promise on HIV and AIDS declaration and for the march and the rally in Washington before the opening of the International AIDS Conference next July. Please join us and the thousands of other groups that have already signed on to ask world leaders to keep the promise on AIDS and keep saving lives. Sign on to the declaration today. And if you can, please join us in Washington next summer. Thank you. Siyabonga.